Welcome guys to Purpose Opinion. So on this video, I want to talk about why does Canada sell so much electricity to USA and why the system is set up in such a way. Okay. And first of all, I'll just give you guys some background. I worked as a power trader in this place called Alberta, Canada. So I have some knowledge about how the electricity grids are connected in North America. And the reason I'm bringing up this topic is because recently we heard that Doug Ford is gonna put tariffs on electricity Ontario sells to USA. At least he put the threat of that tariff. And you have to understand why the system is set up in such a way. It actually comes down to three main things. One, it's much colder in Canada. So for those of you who are not well versed about how power plants work, power plants operate more efficiently when the outside weather is cooler. Okay, and the reason is quite simple. Most power plants, especially gas-fired turbines, they have to suck in outside air. And so if the outside air is hotter, it has less mass, less density, and so less power can be generated using that light, warmer air. Versus if the air is colder, it's heavier and more energy can be generated using that heavier, denser, colder air. And because Canada is colder as in general, the power plants in Canada are much more efficient. That's one reason that Canada has an edge. Canadian power plants have an edge over the US counterparts. But the bigger reason is here mainly the spread between the US and Canadian dollar, right? And as the spread increases, as the Canadian dollar weakens against US dollar, right? So the same electricity that's being generated in Canada is now more attractive and cheaper for US customers to buy, just because of the spread between US dollar and CAD, right? And so there's the financial instrument that's playing a part, obviously, but also because Canada generates much, much more electricity than it needs on any given day. They have too much natural resources, some say, but it does come down to that thing, like colder temperature, more efficient power plants, cheaper electricity as the CAD deteriorates against the US dollar, and also because they have deployed way too much natural resources to generate electricity and clean electricity in many cases in Canada. Canada's electricity grid is actually much cleaner than USA, most of USA. And so the other part, this is the more like significant part of the puzzle, which is that America does not have significant transmission network. Okay, the America has more than enough power plants, more than enough power capacity to satisfy the demand of its customers. What it does not have is enough transmission capacity to distribute the power to where it is required across America. So you'll see that's the fundamental reason why all of these Canadian bordering US states are so dependent on Canada. Like if you're in Ontario, you're like New York, Wisconsin, these northeastern US states are dependent on Ontario, Quebec for power. And then in the west, you have BC has a transmission network with yeah, Seattle, Portland in Oregon, right? So and the so it that's the fundamental issue. The issue is does not have enough transmission capacity to distribute the power that they have evenly across America where it's required. And that's why these neighboring, bordering US states to Canada are so dependent on Canada to get sufficient power. And this problem will not be solved overnight. Like, you know, drawing up those transmission lines is not going to happen overnight. So, this is the more inherent structural problem that America has, which is lack of transmission capacity. And it's not good enough that, oh, this area, our latest analysis shows that this area in USA has a surge in demand in power. Let's build a power plant next to this area. That's not a sustainable way to go about this because that power demand in that area could vary from season to season. So yeah, now that area has a high increase in demand in power, but people might leave that area in the future, and then the power demand in that area will drop. But a power plant is not established overnight. It requires usually 20 to 30 years of capex that has to be considered, right? Power plant, when you run a power plant, you run it in an economically feasible way that you recoup the capital cost but in 20, 30 years term. That's not going to be possible if your business strategy is targeting an area that saw a recent increase in power demand because the power demand can drop in the future in the next 20, 30 years. Anything can happen. What's a more feasible, economically feasible business strategy is if the government steps in to improve the transmission capacity so that even if the power demand close to the power plant drops in the near term future, the power plant can still sell their power to somewhere else in USA and still be economically feasible to run. And so that's the fundamental issue here, the lack of transmission capacity, the weakening of the Canadian dollar against US dollar, and also because Canada, because they have abundant natural resource and not enough power demand, their electricity is just cheaper in general. And because it's colder out there, it's more efficient to generate those plants. So yeah, it's a mixture of things, and I think nothing will change overnight, even if Trump declares an national electricity emergency or whatever he wants to do. I don't think anything will change overnight because the transmission capacity will require years, maybe decades to be built in USA. So, yeah, I mean, the short-term strategy would be to build some ready-to-use SMRs or small power plants in the neighboring states, Canadian bordered neighbor US states, to satisfy the short-term deficit in power supply from Canada, right? But again, that's not a long-term solution because, like I said, people might leave that area, the power demand might fall, and then those power plants will become economically unfeasible to run, right? So yeah, it is much more technical. I think the end result will be a few more power plants getting built in those bordering US states, and just overall decrease in power prices. I mean, the US states and Canadian provinces that are neighbors. Because once Trump leaves and then you have a more Canadian friendly American president coming into the office, those power plants are still going to be there, but now they'll be able to be deployed to sell uh, electricity into Canada if possible. So you'll have end up with a result with more power generation, more power supply stack for Canadian electricity grid neighbor for the provinces that Canada is neighbor with US. So you'll have more electricity supply for Canada in general and for the US states bordering Canada. That'll be likely the end result, cheaper power for Canada. But yeah, I just wanted to talk about that in general. Yeah, that's it for this one.